Hi everyone, wish you a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore how one anonymous file nearly tears a family apart, just when Diep and Jame finally dare to breathe again. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning on Diep's small street felt gentle. A pot of porridge warmed the kitchen, and sunlight lay across the table like a quiet blessing. On the floor, little Nee drew with crayons, slow, focused, as if drawing could keep the world steady. Jame arrived with fruit and a simple bouquet. His smile was there, but so was the tiredness behind it, the kind that comes from carrying too many nights alone. "You didn't have to bring all this," Diep said. "I wanted to," Jame replied. He crouched to Nee's level, waved softly, and Nee pressed closer to Diep's knee, watching him with serious eyes that were too old for 5. For a moment, it was peace. Spoons clinking, a small laugh, the kind of warmth that feels earned. Then Jame's phone vibrated. He checked the screen once, and the color left his face. Diep set her spoon down. "Is it work?" Jame's voice came out low. "It's my mother." Mrs Huyen sat in her living room with the curtains half closed. On the table lay an envelope with her name typed neatly. No sender, no address, just intent. Inside was a thick folder of printed pages, screenshots, bank statements, a headline-style cover page that read like a verdict. Diep's name was stamped across it, paired with words like irregularities and debt trail. There was even a photo of Diep mid-step outside a building, the kind of photo that looks like proof when you want to believe the worst. Mrs Huyen knew paper could lie, but she also knew paper could ruin. She called Jame immediately. "Jame," she said, breath tight, "why are people sending me this? Why does it say Diep is involved in financial trouble?" On the other end, silence, too long to be comfort. "Mom," Jame finally said, "it's not the truth, it's a trap." "By who?" Jame hesitated, then spoke the name like swallowing glass. "Mr Phat." Mrs Huyen's eyes closed. In this family, some truths didn't need explanation. The name carried old shame, old anger, old unfinished wars. "I want to see Diep," she said. "Today." Diep didn't refuse. She didn't hide, didn't beg, didn't perform innocence. She simply made tea, straightened the table, and kept her hands calm for Nee's sake. When Mrs Huyen arrived, the house went quiet, in the way it does when people love each other but don't know how to be safe. They sat across from one another. The folder lay between them like a third person. "Tell me," Mrs Huyen said. Diep looked at the pages, then up at her. "Some of it is real," she admitted. "I had debts before. I worked to clear them. Jame knew. The rest is stitched together to make you doubt me." Mrs Huyen's voice softened, but the fear stayed sharp. "Why would anyone do this?" Jame answered for her. "Because he wants control. He knows he can't break me with business anymore, so he's touching home." Mrs Huyen's fingers tightened around her cup. "He's your father," she whispered. Jame's gaze didn't flinch. "He's a man who uses blood like a contract." Mrs Huyen looked at Nee on the floor, lining crayons by color, listening without speaking. The sight made her older fears rise, that children pay for adult wars. "Diep," Mrs Huyen said quietly, "I'm not here to insult you. I'm here because I've seen powerful men ruin women and call it protection. I don't want you destroyed, and I don't want my son destroyed with you." Diep's throat tightened. "I never wanted to bring trouble to your family." Mrs Huyen held her gaze. "Then promise me you won't let him drag you into darkness." Jame nodded. I promise. Diep didn't say, I promise. She only nodded once, because she had already been living that promise. When the tea cooled and the words ran out, Mrs Huyen asked Jame to step outside with her. They stood by the gate where afternoon light turned everything gold, the way it does right before it disappears. Mrs Huyen's voice was smaller there. You look tired, Jame. I am, he admitted. She stared at him for a long moment, like she was searching for the child she once carried, not the CEO everyone praised. You love her, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Jame replied. And I love you. Mrs Huyen's eyes shimmered. Then don't make me choose between you and my fear. Jame lowered his head. I'm not asking you to be fearless, Mom. I'm asking you to be with us while we're afraid. Mrs Huyen didn't answer right away. She just nodded once, a nod that meant, I will try. That night, Diep washed dishes that were already clean, letting the running water cover the sound of her thoughts. If I leave, she said finally, he loses leverage. Jame stepped closer. That's exactly what he wants. He wants you gone, so I'm alone. Diep's eyes went to the living room. Nai had fallen asleep with a worn plush rabbit, her small face peaceful for now. On the table was the drawing from the morning, 3 stick figures inside one house. Diep stared at it until her vision blurred. I want peace, Diep whispered. For her, Jame's voice stayed firm, gentle. Peace won't come from surrender, it will come from proof. Proof? Diep asked. Jame's jaw tightened. Evidence. I'm done being afraid. Later, after Jame left, Diep walked to a small nearby church. The door was open, the air inside cool and still. She didn't go for miracles. She went for the quiet. She sat in the last row, hands clasped, and asked for one simple thing. That the adults could stop turning love into a battlefield. When she returned home, Nai was still asleep. Diep covered her with a blanket and whispered a promise into the dark. Not in words, but in the way she kissed her forehead and stayed. The next day, Jame met Hung in a quiet corner away from glass and ears. Hung listened without interrupting, then placed a small USB drive on the hood of a car. I checked the documents, Hung said. Some screenshots were edited. The timestamps don't match. The bank template is from a different year. Jame exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. But, Hung added, we still need a link that ties Mr Phat to whoever made it. A payment. A messenger. Something a judge can't ignore. Jame's voice dropped. If we get that link, I can stop running. Hung nodded. And stop letting him choose the rules. Jame looked away, jaw tight. He doesn't just want my company. He wants my obedience. He wants me to abandon Diep and leave Nai in a house that learns fear. Hung's eyes stayed calm. Then we don't give him that ending. Before the dinner, Jame went to his mother's house alone. Mrs Huyen was standing by the window, holding the folder like she hadn't dared to put it down. I keep thinking of your childhood, she said, but back then I could close the door and keep danger outside. Now danger wears a suit and comes with papers. Jame stepped closer. You don't have to carry this alone. Mrs Huyen looked at him, eyes tired. I'm afraid you'll ruin your life fighting him. Jame's voice softened. My life isn't my title. It's the people I come home to. For the first time since the envelope arrived, Mrs Huyen's shoulders lowered. Then promise me one more thing, she whispered. If you fight clean. Don't become him. I won't, Jame said. That's why I asked Hung for help. Sunday evening, Mrs Huyen invited them to dinner. Nothing grand, just soup, warm rice, candlelight that made the room feel like a sanctuary. Diep arrived with knee, hand in hand. Before entering, Diep paused and adjusted Knee's collar, smoothing the child's hair the way mothers do when their own hearts are shaking. Mrs Huyen opened the door. She didn't hug Diep, but she touched her shoulder lightly, an older woman's way of saying, "I'm trying." At the table, Mrs Huyen served soup with steady hands. Jame watched her carefully, like he was watching a bridge hold wait. They had only just begun eating when the doorbell rang. Jame's spine went rigid. Mrs Huyen stood. For a second, she looked at Jame. Silent permission and silent fear. And then she opened the door. Mr Phat stepped in like the house belonged to him. Dark suit, no tie, a smile that looked polite until you stood close enough to feel the cold. "Mrs. Huyen," he said smoothly, "I hope I'm not intruding." Diep rose, instinctively shifting to shield Nai behind her chair. Nai clutched the plush rabbit tighter, eyes wide. Jame's voice dropped. "Why are you here?" Mr Phat walked to the table and placed an envelope down with deliberate care. "To end this unpleasantness, sign the transfer, step away from this situation, and the rumors disappear." Diep stared at the envelope as if it were a knife wrapped in paper. Jame's eyes burned. "So, you attack Diep until I obey." Mr Phat shrugged. "I don't attack, I reveal. The world does the rest." Mrs Huyen's voice shook. "You sent that folder." "A mother deserves to know," Mr Phat replied, looking at Diep without shame. "And a son should return to the life he was meant to live." Climax 1 landed in the room, not with shouting, but with the way fear tried to rewrite love. Diep turned to Jame, eyes bright with held-back tears. "If you need me to go, I can." "Don't," Jame said, sharp as a vow. Mr Phat smiled, satisfied. "See? Even she understands." Jame's palm hit the table once, one clean sound that made the candles jump. "No," Jame said. "She understands love. You understand control." Climax 2 arrived as Jame reached into his pocket and set his phone on speaker. "Hung," he said. Hung answered immediately. "I'm here." Mr Phat's eyes narrowed. Jame tapped the screen, and a recording played. Mr Phat's voice, unmistakable, discussing documents, fees, and making the mother doubt. Not loud, not dramatic, just cold, practical cruelty. Mrs Huyen covered her mouth. Her knees weakened, but she didn't sit. Mr Phat hissed, "Illegal." Jame didn't blink. "So is what you did." He looked at his mother. "Mom, you asked me not to let him drag us into darkness. I kept that promise by preparing a light." Then he faced Mr Phat fully. "You want my company? Take me to court. You want to smear Diep? Then know this. I will defend her publicly, legally, and with everything I am. I'm done being afraid." Mrs Huyen stepped forward, voice suddenly clear. "Leave my home." Mr Phat stared at her, surprised, then amused. He turned toward the door, but paused. "You think this ends because you played one recording?" he murmured. "A storm doesn't stop when you name it." He walked out. The door closed, and the candles kept burning, small but stubborn. Mrs Huyen turned to Diep, eyes wet. "I'm sorry." Diep shook her head gently. "You're a mother. I understand." Mrs Huyen glanced at Nee, silent, wide-eyed, clutching the rabbit, and her face softened into something like resolve. "We will not let fear raise this child," Mrs Huyen said. Jame nodded, voice thick. "We won't." Later, when the house finally quieted, Jame stood by the window with Diep. Outside, the city looked peaceful, as if it didn't know what families carried. "He'll come back," Diep whispered. I know, Jame replied, but we're not alone anymore. Diep leaned into him, trembling with relief and worry at the same time. Jame's phone vibrated again. Unknown number. One line of text. See you in court. James stared at it, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He didn't reply. He only held Diep a little closer. In the dining room, the last candle flickered, still standing. And somewhere beyond the quiet, a storm gathered its breath.
Trong tập này, Diệp rơi vào bước đường cùng khi công ty bị mua sạch đơn hàng, nợ nần và sát bờ phá sản. Ông Phát hẹn gặp, đưa 20.000 USD và một hợp đồng mua lại, xóa nợ còn dư tiền, nhưng đổi lại Diệp phải rời xa Jame. Diệp cắn răng từ chối vì cô hiểu nếu nhận tiền, tình yêu và lòng tự trọng sẽ mất. Đúng lúc lời ép buộc lên cao, ông Phát choáng váng ngã gục vì bệnh tim. Diệp không do dự, gọi xe và đưa ông vào bệnh viện kịp thời. Jame đến nơi vừa biết ơn vừa bối rối, sợ đây chỉ là cái bẫy thật. Trước cửa phòng cấp cứu, Diệp im lặng tay run, chỉ hỏi: nếu hôm nay tôi cứu bác có để chúng tôi yên không?